There's no pain quite like watching your child suffer and feeling powerless to help. For Sarah Mitchell, that pain had become her daily companion in a lonely mountain cabin where she raised her silent daughter alone. The girl hadn't spoken in months and never responded when her mother called her name. A traveling doctor had delivered the heartbreaking news. Her daughter was blind and would live in darkness forever. Sarah had learned to accept it, guiding her child's hand through each day with patience and love. Then a mountain man arrived at their door one winter evening, and within an hour he saw something Sarah had missed. The child could see, but why would a little girl pretend to be blind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory, in the winter of 1887, was not a forgiving place. Snow fell in thick curtains across the mountain ranges, burying the narrow trails and isolating the scattered homesteads that clung to the rocky slopes like barnacles to a ship's hull. The cabin where Sarah Mitchell lived with her daughter sat in a small clearing halfway up Copper Ridge, surrounded by towering pines that creaked and groaned under the weight of ice. Smoke rose steadily from the stone chimney, a thin grey line. Against the white sky, the only sign of human life for miles in any direction. Sarah stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the wind drive fresh snow across the yard. She was 32 years old, though the mirror suggested someone older. Her dark hair, once lustrous and carefully pinned, now hung in a simple braid down her back, streaked with premature grey at the temples. Her hands, red and chapped from endless work, rested on the windowsill. She wore a plain wool dress, patched at the elbows, and a shawl her mother had knitted years ago. The wedding ring she'd once worn on her left hand now hung from a thin silver chain around her neck, tucked beneath her collar, where she could feel its weight against her heart. Behind her, in the corner near the fire, sat Emma, 6 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her father's grey eyes. The girl sat perfectly still in a wooden chair, too large for her frame, her feet dangling above the floor. In her arms she clutched a teddy bear, worn nearly bald from constant handling. The bear's button eyes had been sewn back on multiple times, and one ear hung by a few threads. Emma's own eyes stared forward at nothing in particular, unfocused and distant. She hadn't spoken since the autumn, hadn't called for her mother, or cried out in the night, or laughed at anything Sarah tried to make cheerful. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire and the howl of wind outside. Sarah had grown accustomed to it, this quiet that pressed down on everything like the snow outside. She talked to Emma constantly, filling the void with gentle narration of her tasks, but Emma never responded. Not with words, not with gestures, not even with the slightest change in expression. Sarah turned from the window and crossed to the table where she'd been preparing their midday meal. Venison stew, the same as yesterday and the day before. The meat came from their small stores, hunted by Thomas before he died, before everything changed. She stirred the pot hanging over the fire, then ladled some into a wooden bowl. She carried it to Emma, set it on the small table beside her, and guided the child's hand to the spoon. "It's warm, sweetheart," Sarah said softly. "Be careful not to burn yourself." Emma's fingers closed around the spoon. She lifted it mechanically to her mouth, her movement slow and deliberate, as though she were navigating by memory and touch alone. Sarah watched, her heart aching with the familiar weight of helplessness. The doctor who'd passed through 6 months ago, a traveling physician making his rounds through the remote settlements, had examined Emma and delivered his verdict with the casual certainty of a man who'd seen everything. "The child is blind, Mrs. Mitchell," he'd said, smelling of whiskey even at mid-morning. "Sometimes happens after a shock to the system. The mind protects itself in strange ways. She may never see again. Best you learn to accept it and make the necessary accommodations." He'd left her with those words and nothing else. No remedies, no hope, no path forward except acceptance. Sarah had cried that night after Emma was asleep, buried her face in her pillow so the girl wouldn't hear. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and decided that if Emma would live in darkness, then Sarah would be her light. She would guide every step, describe every moment, fill the silence with her voice until perhaps someday Emma might find her own voice again. But 2 years had passed since Thomas died, and Emma had only retreated further into herself. Thomas. Sarah's hand went to the chain around her neck, finding the ring through the fabric. Thomas Mitchell had been a good man, a kind husband, a devoted father. He'd worked the small claim he'd staked in the valley below, pulling copper ore from the mountain's belly with determination and hope. He dreamed of striking it rich, of moving Sarah and Emma to a real town, with schools and churches and neighbors close enough to visit. He'd worked himself to exhaustion chasing that dream. Then one October afternoon, he simply hadn't come home. They'd found him at the bottom of a shaft, his neck broken. An accident, they said, a tragic accident. The support timber had given way, the foreman explained. These things happened in mining. Thomas had been alone at the time, working a new section. No witnesses, no one to say exactly what occurred. Just a good man dead and a family left to survive without him. Emma had been 4 years old. She'd been unusually quiet in the days after Thomas's funeral, clinging to Sarah's skirts and refusing to play with the other children when neighbors came to pay respects. But she'd still been herself, still Emma with her bright laugh and curious questions. The change had come gradually over the following months. First the nightmares, then the withdrawal, then the silence. By the time the traveling doctor arrived, Emma had stopped responding to anything she couldn't touch. Sarah had assumed it was grief, a child's way of processing loss too large for a young mind to hold. The doctor's diagnosis of blindness had seemed to confirm it. The shock of losing her father had somehow stolen Emma's sight. It was cruel, incomprehensible, but Sarah had no choice except to believe it and adapt. She'd learned to announce her presence before touching Emma, to describe everything she placed in the girl's hands, to guide her through the cabin step by measured step. She'd rearranged the furniture so Emma could navigate by memory, keeping everything in the same place always. She'd tied bells to the door so Emma would know when it opened. She'd spoken constantly, narrating life so Emma could build a map of the world through sound alone. And Emma had adapted in turn. She moved through the cabin with increasing confidence, her hands trailing along the walls and furniture. She fed herself, dressed herself with help, even helped with simple chores like folding blankets, but she never initiated anything, never reached for something on her own, never turned her head to look at anything because, Sarah believed, she couldn't see anything to look at. The wind rattled the shutters, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. She glanced at the window again, noting how the snow had intensified. This would be a bad storm. She could feel it. They were well stocked with firewood and food, secure enough in their little cabin, but the isolation pressed more heavily during storms. No possibility of visitors, no chance of riding down to the settlement for supplies or conversation, just mother and daughter, alone with the wind and silence. Sarah moved through the cabin, checking their stores out of habit. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork. Enough for another month, maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. The chickens had stopped laying with the cold, but she had preserved eggs from autumn. The root cellar held potatoes and turnips, apples wrapped in newspaper. They would survive the winter. They always did, but surviving wasn't the same as living, and Sarah knew it. She watched Emma finish her stew, the girl's face expressionless, and wondered if this was all their life would ever be. This quiet, this careful routine, this half-life where they existed but didn't truly live. Emma was 6 years old. She should be running and playing, learning to read, making friends. Instead, she sat in silence, trapped in darkness, and Sarah had no idea how to bring her back. The knock at the door came just as Sarah was clearing away the lunch dishes. 3 sharp raps, loud enough to hear over the wind. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly pounding. No one traveled in weather like this. No one came this far up the mountain unless they were lost or desperate. She glanced at Emma, who sat perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as though listening. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the door, her hand hovering over the latch. "Who's there?" she called. "Name's Jacob Stone," came a man's voice, rough and deep. "I'm seeking shelter from the storm. I mean no harm, Mom. Just need a place to wait out the weather." Sarah's mind raced. She lived alone with a child. She had no way to defend herself if this man had ill intentions. But she also knew the code of the mountains. You didn't turn away someone in a storm, not unless you wanted their death on your conscience. She made her decision, sent a quick prayer heavenward, and opened the door. The man who stood on her threshold was large, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard white with frost. He wore a heavy coat of bear fur and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His eyes, when he lifted his head to meet her gaze, were a startling blue, clear and direct. He looked to be in his late 40s, his face weathered by sun and wind, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. He held his hands where she could see them, palms open, empty. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice gentler than his appearance suggested. "I won't trouble you long, just until the storm passes." Sarah stepped back, allowing him entrance. He moved past her carefully, not crowding her space, and stopped just inside the door. Snow fell from his coat in clumps as the warmth of the cabin hit him. His eyes swept the room, taking everything in with what seemed like professional assessment. And then his gaze settled on Emma. The girl sat motionless in her chair, the teddy bear clutched to her chest, her face turned toward the fire. She gave no indication that she'd heard the door open or that a stranger had entered their home. Jacob Stone studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then looked back at Sarah. "Your daughter?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said, closing the door and latching it against the wind. "Emma, she's 6 years old. She doesn't speak much." "I see," Jacob said, and something in his tone made Sarah glance at him sharply. But he'd already turned away, shrugging out of his heavy coat and hanging it on the peg beside the door. Beneath it he wore buckskin and wool, practical clothes for mountain travel. He removed his hat, revealing iron-gray hair cut short. "You can warm yourself by the fire," Sarah said, suddenly aware of how small the cabin was with this large man in it. "I'll make coffee." "Appreciate it," Jacob said. He moved to the hearth, his footsteps surprisingly quiet for a man his size, and held his hands out to the flames. But Sarah noticed he'd positioned himself so he could see both her and Emma, so his back was to no one. A careful man, a cautious man, or perhaps just a man who'd lived long enough in wild places to know better than to be careless. Sarah busied herself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. She filled the pot with water from the bucket, added grounds, and set it on the iron hook over the fire. The familiar ritual steadied her nerves. She snuck glances at the stranger, trying to assess whether she'd made a terrible mistake letting him inside. Jacob Stone seemed content to stand in silence, warming himself. But his eyes kept returning to Emma, and Sarah saw something in his gaze she couldn't quite identify. Not threat, not cruelty. Something more like puzzlement or perhaps recognition. After a few minutes, Jacob spoke. "She's been like this long?" Sarah stiffened. "I don't see how that's your concern." "It's not," Jacob agreed easily. "Forgive me. I've spent too long alone in the mountains. I've forgotten proper manners." Sarah relented slightly. "Since her father died," she said quietly. 2 years ago. "The doctor says she's blind." The shock of losing her father took her sight. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in that same gentle tone, "That must be very hard for you both." Something in his voice, some note of genuine understanding, made Sarah's throat tighten. She blinked against sudden tears. "We manage," she said. The coffee began to boil. Sarah poured 2 cups, added sugar to both, and handed one to Jacob. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she was struck by how warm his hand was, how steady. He nodded his thanks and sipped the coffee, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "Good and strong," he said. "Haven't had proper coffee in weeks. You live in the mountains?" Sarah asked, curiosity overcoming caution. I do, Jacob confirmed. I trap mostly. Hunt some, keep to myself. I have a small place about 10 miles north of here, but I was checking my trap lines when the storm caught me. Saw your smoke and knew there was a cabin up this way. You're lucky you found us, Sarah said. Another mile and you'd have been past the clearing. I don't believe much in luck, Jacob said. But I'm grateful nonetheless. He paused, then added, You're alone up here? Just you and the girl? Sarah's back straightened. We do fine on our own. I'm sure you do, Jacob said, no challenge in his voice. I just meant it's isolated. Hard country for a woman alone. It was my husband's claim, Sarah said. This is our home. Jacob nodded, accepting this. He sipped his coffee and seemed content to let the silence stretch. Sarah found herself studying him more carefully. Despite his rough appearance, there was something refined in his bearing, something that suggested education or perhaps military background. He held himself with the posture of someone accustomed to command, but his manner was respectful, almost courtly in its old-fashioned way. A sudden movement caught both their attention. Emma had shifted in her chair, turning her head slightly toward where Jacob stood. Her expression remained blank, but something in the angle of her head suggested she was listening, paying attention in whatever way she could. Jacob set down his coffee cup and moved slowly across the room. Sarah tensed, ready to intervene, but Jacob's approach was so careful, so obviously non-threatening, that she held back. He stopped several feet from Emma's chair and lowered himself into a crouch, bringing his face level with hers. "Hello, Emma," he said softly. "My name is Jacob. I'm very pleased to meet you." Emma didn't respond. She clutched her teddy bear tighter, her knuckles white. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I make things," he said, still in that gentle voice. "Would you like to feel something I made?" He held out his hand, palm up, offering. Sarah stepped closer to see what he held. It was a small carved figure, a bird rendered in beautiful detail from a piece of pale wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every feather distinct, the tiny head tilted as though in song. Emma's hand, seemingly of its own accord, reached out. Her fingers touched the carving, explored its shape with delicate care. And then something extraordinary happened. The corner of Emma's mouth lifted, just the smallest fraction, in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't seen Emma smile in so long, she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Jacob watched Emma's face with that same puzzled intensity Sarah had noticed before. Then he gently closed Emma's fingers around the bird. "You can keep it," he said. "I can always make another." He stood, his knees creaking slightly, and turned to face Sarah. His expression was thoughtful, almost troubled. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "may I ask you something?" "What is it?" Sarah asked, still staring at Emma's hand, at the way she held the carved bird as carefully as she held her teddy bear. "When the doctor examined your daughter," Jacob said slowly, "did he test her eyes? Did he check to see if she could follow a light or track movement?" Sarah frowned. "He looked at her eyes, yes. He said they were undamaged physically, but that sometimes the mind shuts down the eyes, even when nothing's wrong with them." Jacob nodded slowly. "And you've seen no sign she can see anything at all?" "None," Sarah said. "She never reacts to visual things, only to sound and touch." "Why do you ask?" Jacob seemed to be weighing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "I'm probably mistaken, but I'd like to stay and observe a bit longer if you'll allow it. Just until the storm passes." Sarah looked at him, at this stranger who'd appeared on her doorstep, and felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. "You think you know something," she said. "About Emma, I think," Jacob said carefully, "that I might. But I need to be certain before I say anything more." The wind howled outside, and Sarah made her decision. "You can stay," she said, "at least until we know for sure." The storm settled in for the duration, as Montana storms often did. By late afternoon, the world beyond the cabin windows had disappeared into a white void, and the wind shrieked like something alive and hungry. Sarah lit the oil lamps early, their golden glow pushing back the premature darkness. Jacob had made himself useful, bringing in extra firewood from the covered pile outside and checking the shutters to ensure they were secure. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to preparing for hard weather. Emma had retreated to her small bed in the corner, the carved bird tucked safely beside her teddy bear. Sarah had given her dinner early, and the girl had eaten without incident, her movements as mechanical as always. Now she lay curled on her side, facing the wall, her breathing slow and even. Whether she slept or simply withdrew into herself, Sarah couldn't say. Jacob sat at the table, accepting Sarah's offer of venison stew with genuine appreciation. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Sarah found herself wondering when he'd last had a proper meal. Mountain men were a hardy breed, but living alone in the wilderness took its toll. She'd seen it in the men who occasionally passed through, a certain lean hunger, not just for food, but for company, for conversation, for the small human comforts that made life bearable. "You're a fine cook, Mrs. Mitchell," Jacob said, setting down his spoon. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." "It's just stew," Sarah said, though she felt pleased nonetheless. "Nothing special. Everything's special when you've been eating your own cooking for months," Jacob replied with a slight smile. "I can manage to keep myself fed, but I wouldn't call what I make appetizing." Sarah poured him more coffee and sat down across from him. The cabin felt different with another adult present, less oppressive somehow. The silence between them was comfortable, not weighted with grief and worry, as her silences with Emma always were. "You said you have a place 10 miles north?" Sarah ventured. "Have you been there long?" 5 years, Jacob said. "I came west after the war, did some scouting for the army, then decided I'd had enough of following orders and being around people. Built myself a cabin and settled in." "You were in the war?" Sarah asked. "The rebellion?" "I was," Jacob confirmed. "Union Army, tracker and scout. I have a knack for reading sign, for seeing things others miss. Served me well during the fighting, serves me well now in hunting." Sarah absorbed this information. It explained the military bearing, the careful watchfulness. "Do you ever miss it?" "Being around people, I mean." Jacob considered this. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But people can be more dangerous than any bear or mountain cat. I've seen what men do to each other when they believe strongly enough in something. After the war, I needed quiet. The mountains gave me that, and now," Jacob's blue eyes met hers directly, "now I'm not so certain I want to be alone forever." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her coffee cup, suddenly flustered. Before she could formulate a response, a sound made both of them turn. Emma had sat up in her bed, the teddy bear clutched to her chest. Her head was tilted, as though listening to something they couldn't hear. Sarah started to rise, but Jacob held up a hand, gesturing for her to wait. Very quietly, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something. Sarah recognized it as the object he'd mentioned earlier, a wooden whistle, beautifully carved. He held it between his fingers, watching Emma with that same intense focus she'd noticed before. Then, deliberately, he opened his hand and let the whistle fall. It hit the wooden floor with a sharp clatter, bounced once and rolled toward the hearth. In that instant, Sarah saw it clearly. Emma's eyes followed the whistle's trajectory. Her head turned, tracking its movement across the floor. Her gaze fixed on where it came to rest, against the stone foundation of the fireplace. Sarah's breath stopped in her chest. Jacob remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Emma, seemingly realizing what she'd done, quickly turned her face back to the wall and squeezed her eyes shut. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jacob said softly. "Did you see that?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. Her eyes moved. "She followed it." "Yes," Jacob confirmed. "She did." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She moved toward Emma's bed, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Emma," she said, her voice shaking. "Emma, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Emma didn't respond. She lay rigid, her eyes pressed tightly closed, her small body tense as a bowstring. "Emma," Sarah said again, kneeling beside the bed. "It's all right. Whatever is happening, whatever you're feeling, it's all right. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Still no response. Sarah reached out to touch her daughter's shoulder, and Emma flinched, pulling away from her mother's touch. The gesture cut Sarah more deeply than any blade could have. Jacob had retrieved the whistle and now stood a respectful distance away, giving them space but watching carefully. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently. "May I try something?" Sarah looked at him, tears blurring her vision. "What?" "I'd like to test her responses. Nothing that will hurt her or frighten her. Just a few simple observations. Will you trust me?" Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to gather Emma in her arms and protect her from whatever this was. But the memory of Emma's eyes following that whistle, the undeniable evidence that her daughter could see, overrode her protective instincts. She nodded. Jacob approached slowly. He pulled a chair close to Emma's bed and sat down, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "Emma," he said in that calm, deep voice, "I know you can hear me. I want you to know that whatever you're afraid of, you're safe now. Your mother loves you, and she would never let anyone hurt you." Emma remained motionless. But Sarah saw her breathing change, becoming more rapid. Jacob continued, "I'm going to move my hand, Emma. I want to see if you can see it. There's nothing to be afraid of. Just watch my hand." He raised his right hand slowly, moving it from left to right across Emma's field of vision. Even with her eyes closed, Sarah saw the flicker beneath Emma's eyelids, the rapid eye movement of someone tracking something they could see. Jacob lowered his hand. "She can see, Mrs. Mitchell. I'd stake my life on it." "But why?" Sarah's voice broke. "Why would she pretend? Why would she put us both through this?" "That," Jacob said heavily, "is what we need to find out. But I don't think she's pretending to hurt you. I think she's protecting herself from something. Or maybe protecting you from something." The words hung in the air like the smoke from the fire. Sarah looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw the fear radiating from the small, tense body. Not the simple fear of a blind child navigating an uncertain world, but something deeper, something darker. "Emma," Sarah whispered, "what did you see? What are you so afraid of?" Emma's only response was to curl more tightly into herself, making her body as small as possible. Jacob stood and gestured for Sarah to follow him back to the table. When they were seated, he leaned forward, his voice low. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about when Emma stopped speaking. When she stopped responding. What was happening in your lives at that time?" Sarah wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "It was after Thomas died, about 2 weeks after the funeral. Emma had nightmares every night, terrible ones. She'd wake up screaming, but she wouldn't tell me what she dreamed about. Then one morning she just didn't speak. She was quiet all day. By the end of the week she'd stopped responding to anything she couldn't touch." "And your husband's death," Jacob said carefully. "They said it was an accident?" "A cave-in at the mine," Sarah said. "The support timber failed. Thomas was working alone in a new shaft. They found him at the bottom, his neck broken." Her voice caught on the words. Even after 2 years, saying it aloud made it fresh again. "Was there an investigation?" Sarah frowned. The mine foreman looked at the site. "He said it was an accident. These things happen in mining. Why?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly on the table. "Mrs. Mitchell, children don't lose their sight from grief." "Not really. That doctor was a fool or a drunk or both. But children do stop speaking when they've seen something too terrible to talk about." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your daughter isn't blind. She can see perfectly well. But for some reason she's chosen to hide that fact. And the only reason a child would do that, in my experience, is if seeing something put her in danger, or if she witnessed something so frightening that she decided it was safer not to see anything at all." "But what could she have seen?" Sarah asked desperately. "She was with me when Thomas died. She was here at the cabin. She didn't see the accident." "Are you certain?" Jacob asked gently. Sarah opened her mouth to say yes. Of course she was certain, but then stopped. The morning Thomas died, she'd been doing laundry out behind the cabin. It was a clear day, warm for October. She'd hung the washing on the line and come inside to start lunch. Emma had been playing in the yard. Or had she? Sarah had assumed Emma was playing in the yard, but she hadn't actually seen her. She called for Emma when lunch was ready, and the girl had come from around the side of the cabin. She could have followed him, Sarah said slowly, horror creeping into her voice. She loved to follow Thomas when he went to work. I always made her stay behind, but that morning I was busy. She could have slipped away. She could have gone down to the mine. And if she did, Jacob said quietly, she might have seen something. Something that wasn't an accident. The words fell between them like stones. Sarah stared at Jacob, wanting to deny it, wanting to say that was impossible. But Emma's behavior suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. The nightmares, the silence, the withdrawal into apparent blindness. Not a child damaged by grief, but a child who had seen something so terrible she'd decided to see nothing at all. Who would hurt Thomas? Sarah whispered. Everyone liked him. He had no enemies. Mining claims cause all sorts of trouble, Jacob said. Disputes over boundaries, over rich veins. Men have killed for less. Sarah felt the room spinning. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. If that's true, if Emma saw someone hurt Thomas, then she's in danger. If whoever did it knows she was there, that's why she's hiding, Jacob said. Not from grief, from fear. She's afraid whoever hurt her father might come for her next. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled, and in her small bed, Emma lay curled tight, clutching a worn teddy bear and a carved bird, trapped in a darkness of her own making because the light had shown her something too terrible to bear. Sarah stood on shaking legs and moved to her daughter's bed. She sat on the edge and laid her hand gently on Emma's shoulder. This time the girl didn't flinch. Emma, Sarah said softly, I don't know what you saw, sweetheart. I don't know what you're carrying inside you, but I promise you I will keep you safe. Whatever it takes, whoever it was, they will never hurt you. Do you understand me? You are safe. Emma's body remained tense, but Sarah felt something shift. A tiny release of held breath, a slight relaxation in the rigid shoulders. Not much, but something. Jacob had moved to the window, looking out at the storm. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, I think I should stay until we can get to the bottom of this. If someone did hurt your husband, and if Emma is a witness, you're both in danger. I can help. Sarah looked at this stranger who had appeared on her doorstep and seen in an hour what she'd missed for 2 years. A stranger who offered protection without being asked, who spoke to her daughter with gentleness and patience, who had somehow unlocked the first piece of a terrible puzzle. Yes, she said. Please stay. Jacob nodded, his expression grave. Then we'll need to be very careful. And we'll need to help Emma understand that she can trust us, that she can show us what she knows. Because until we know who we're dealing with, we're fighting shadows. The storm raged on through the night. And in the small cabin on Copper Ridge, 3 people began the slow, painful process of uncovering a truth that had been buried for 2 years. A truth that a little girl had locked away behind a wall of silence and self-imposed darkness. Believing it was the only way to survive, morning came grey and cold, the storm having exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Sarah woke from fitful sleep on her narrow bed to find weak sunlight filtering through the shutters and the cabin already warm from a rebuilt fire. Jacob sat at the table, whittling something from a piece of wood, the soft scrape of his knife the only sound in the quiet. Emma still slept, or pretended to sleep, curled in her usual position. Sarah watched her daughter for a long moment, seeing her with new eyes now. Not a blind child, navigating by touch and memory, but a seeing child who had chosen darkness. The revelation had kept Sarah awake most of the night, her mind circling the terrible possibility that Thomas's death had been murder, and that Emma had witnessed it. Jacob looked up as Sarah rose and nodded a quiet greeting. He'd fashioned a bed for himself near the fire, from blankets Sarah had provided, and from the looks of things, he'd been awake for some time. The coffee pot steamed gently over the coals. Morning, he said softly. Storm's past, snow's deep, but the sky's clearing. Sarah poured herself coffee and joined him at the table. Her eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, and her mind moved slowly, still processing everything from the night before. Have you been up long? Few hours, Jacob said. Old habit from the war. never could sleep past dawn once the sun started rising. He held up the piece he'd been carving, another bird, this one larger than the first, its wings spread as though in flight. Thought Emma might like another one. If she's going to start collecting them, might as well give her a proper flock. Sarah felt her throat tighten at his thoughtfulness. That's kind of you, Jacob shrugged. Gives my hands something to do while I think. He set down the carving and his knife, giving Sarah his full attention. I've been considering our situation. We need to find out what Emma saw, but we can't push her. If we force her to remember before she's ready, we could make things worse. Then what do we do? Sarah asked. We make her feel safe, Jacob said simply. We show her through our actions that she can trust us, that nothing bad will happen if she opens up. Children are like wild animals in some ways. They won't come to you until they believe you won't hurt them. Sarah nodded slowly. And while we're waiting for her to trust us, I'll do some investigating, Jacob said, quietly. I'll ride down to the settlement, ask some questions about your husband's accident. See if anyone noticed anything strange around that time. But I'll be careful. If someone did hurt Thomas, we don't want them knowing we're asking questions. The plan made sense, though Sarah felt a clutch of fear at the thought of Jacob leaving. In less than a day, she'd come to rely on his presence, his calm certainty. The cabin would feel empty without him. As though reading her thoughts, Jacob added, I won't go today. The snow's too deep for safe travel, and I want to spend more time observing Emma. Tomorrow, maybe, if the weather holds. Emma stirred then, sitting up slowly. Her dark hair stuck up in odd angles, and she clutched her teddy bear as always. She turned her face toward the table, toward them, and Sarah saw her daughter's eyes move, tracking their position before she remembered herself and let her gaze go unfocused again. Good morning. Emma, Sarah said, keeping her voice gentle and normal. Did you sleep well? No response, as expected. Emma slid from her bed and moved toward the table, her steps careful but confident. She knew where everything was in this cabin, had the layout memorized perfectly. Sarah watched her navigate, and now that she knew Emma could see, it was obvious how the girl's eyes would dart to objects before her hands found them. How she avoided obstacles with just a little too much precision for someone truly blind. Jacob pushed the carved bird across the table. I made you another one, Emma. This one's flying. Thought maybe your first bird was lonely. Emma's hand found the carving. Her fingers explored it slowly, tracing the outstretched wings, the tail feathers, the delicate beak. And again, that ghost of a smile flickered across her face before disappearing. You like birds, don't you? Jacob said conversationally, as though talking to another adult. I do too. Up in the mountains I see eagles sometimes. Magnificent creatures. They can spot a rabbit from a mile up and dive down faster than a bullet. But they're graceful too, the way they ride the wind currents, like they're dancing with the sky. Emma listened, her head tilted toward Jacob's voice. Sarah held her breath, hoping for some response, but Emma remained silent. After breakfast, which Emma ate methodically, her movements careful and controlled, Sarah began her daily tasks. She needed to take stock of their supplies, do some mending, keep the cabin in order. Jacob offered to repair a loose shutter he'd noticed, and Sarah gratefully accepted. Having purpose, having work to occupy his hands, seemed natural to him. While Jacob worked outside, Sarah moved to the small chest where she kept Thomas's belongings. She'd avoided going through his things for months, unable to face the reminders of what she'd lost. But now, with Jacob's words from the night before echoing in her mind, she felt compelled to look again. Perhaps there was something she'd missed, some clue to what had really happened to her husband. Emma sat in her chair by the fire, apparently paying no attention, but Sarah noticed how still the girl had become, how tension crept into her small shoulders. The chest smelled of tobacco and leather when Sarah opened it. Thomas's good shirt, worn only to church and funerals. His pocket watch stopped at the moment of his death. A tintype photograph of their wedding day, both of them young and full of hope. And beneath these, a leather-bound journal. Sarah had forgotten about the journal. Thomas had kept it sporadically, writing when the mood struck him. She lifted it out, the leather soft and worn under her fingers, and opened to a random page. His handwriting sprawled across the yellowed paper, confident and clear. May 12th, 1885. The new shaft looks promising. Struck a good vein of copper ore 3 feet down. Might be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Old man Cullen came by today, asking questions about my claim boundaries. Told him everything was legal and filed proper with the territorial office. He didn't look pleased. Need to keep an eye on that situation. Sarah frowned. She remembered Cullen vaguely, a prospector who worked a claim in the next valley over. He'd been at Thomas's funeral, she recalled, standing at the back with his hat in his hands. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Most of the small mining community had attended. She flipped through more pages, scanning the entries. Most were mundane. Weather observations, notes about ore quality, small domestic details. But then, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, October 3rd, 1885, Cullen getting more aggressive about my claim. Says he filed first and I'm working his territory. I've checked my papers 3 times, everything is in order. I have the legal right to this land. Told him as much. He left angry. Don't trust the man. Something hard and desperate in his eyes. Emma saw us arguing. Asked me why the man was yelling. Told her not to worry, that grown-ups sometimes disagree, but it doesn't mean anything. Wish I believed that myself? Sarah's hands trembled on the page. Emma had seen Thomas and Cullen argue. If there was bad blood between them, if Cullen had believed Thomas was stealing his claim, then Thomas's death being an accident became far less certain. She looked up and found Emma watching her, actually watching her, with clear, focused eyes, full of understanding and something that looked like fear. Their gazes locked for a heartbeat before Emma quickly looked away, retreating back into her protective blindness. But it was too late. Sarah had seen the truth in her daughter's eyes. "Emma," Sarah said softly, setting the journal aside and moving to kneel in front of her daughter's chair. "You saw him, didn't you? You saw the man who hurt Papa." Emma's breathing quickened. She clutched the teddy bear so tightly her knuckles went white. "It's all right," Sarah whispered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I know now. I know you're not blind. I know you're trying to protect yourself. But, sweetheart, hiding from what happened won't make it go away. And that man, whoever he is, he doesn't know you saw him. He thinks you were here, at the cabin, just like everyone else thinks." Emma's eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking from the corners. "Tell me," Sarah said, her own voice breaking. "Tell me what happened to Papa. Please, Emma, I need to know." For a long moment, nothing. Then Emma's lips moved, forming words that came out as barely a whisper. "The bad man pushed him." Sarah's world tilted. To hear Emma speak after so long, to hear those words, struck her like a physical blow. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight as Emma began to cry, real crying, not the silent tears of the past 2 years, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her small body. "I saw," Emma gasped between sobs. "I followed Papa. I wasn't supposed to. I hid behind the rocks. The bad man came." They yelled. "Papa said to leave him alone. The bad man pushed Papa down the hole. Papa fell and didn't get up. The bad man looked around. I hid. I didn't move. I was so scared." "Shh," Sarah murmured, rocking her daughter. "You're safe. You're safe now." "I closed my eyes," Emma continued, the words pouring out now after 2 years of silence. "I kept them closed so I wouldn't see anything bad anymore. If I can't see, the bad man can't find me. If I can't see, maybe Papa will come back. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe—" "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her own tears flowing freely now. "It did happen, and it wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault." The door opened and Jacob stepped inside, his face immediately registering concern at the scene before him. Sarah looked up at him through her tears and nodded. "She spoke," Sarah said. "She saw Thomas die. She saw someone push him." Jacob closed the door quietly and removed his coat with deliberate movements, giving them space. "Did she say who?" Sarah looked down at Emma, who had buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "Emma, can you tell us who the bad man was? Did you know him?" Emma's voice was muffled but audible. "The yelling man. The one who came before and made Papa angry." Sarah met Jacob's eyes over Emma's head. "Cullen," she said. "His name is Cullen." Jacob's expression hardened. "That's a name to work with. Do you know his first name? Where his claim is?" "Marcus Cullen," Sarah said, her memory suddenly sharp and clear. He works a claim about 5 miles southeast of here, or he did. I don't know if he's still there. I'll find out, Jacob said grimly. But first, we need to make sure you're both secure here. If Cullen did this, if he killed Thomas over a mining dispute, he won't want any witnesses coming forward. Emma's grip on Sarah tightened. Is the bad man coming? No, Jacob said, moving to crouch beside them. His voice was firm but kind. Not if I have anything to say about it. Emma, you've been very brave. Braver than most grown men I've known. Now you need to be brave a little bit longer while I make sure you and your mama are safe. Can you do that? Emma lifted her head from Sarah's shoulder and looked directly at Jacob, really looked at him without pretense or hiding. Her grey eyes were red-rimmed and full of tears, but there was something else there too, a spark of the little girl she'd been before tragedy struck. She nodded. Good girl, Jacob said. Now I want you to remember something important. What you saw wasn't your fault. You didn't cause it, and you couldn't have stopped it. The bad man did something terrible, and he's the one who should be afraid now. Not you, not anymore. Understand? Emma nodded again, and then, in a voice still hoarse from disuse, she said, Thank you. Jacob's weathered face softened. You're welcome, little one. Sarah held her daughter close, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. Grief for all the time lost to silence and fear, rage at the man who had stolen Thomas from them and terrorized Emma into hiding, relief that the truth was finally emerging, and underneath it all, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through this darkness together. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds. And in the small cabin on Copper Ridge, a little girl who had hidden in darkness for 2 years finally opened her eyes to the light. The afternoon passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and revelation. Emma spoke only occasionally, her voice still hesitant and soft, but each word felt like a small miracle to Sarah. The child moved differently now, no longer pretending to navigate by touch alone. She looked at things openly, reached for objects without the careful pretense of searching. It was as though a great weight had been lifted from her small shoulders, and she was tentatively testing what it felt like to be free. Jacob spent time securing the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure the shutters could be barred from inside. He moved methodically, his military training evident in the thorough way he assessed their defenses. Sarah watched him work and felt safer than she had in 2 years. Not because she was a helpless woman in need of protection, she'd survived alone in the wilderness long enough to prove her strength, but because he approached the situation with competence and care, treating her as a partner rather than someone to be managed. While Jacob worked outside, reinforcing the woodshed door and checking sight lines from the cabin, Sarah drew Emma into a quiet conversation. They sat together on Sarah's bed, close enough for Sarah to hold her daughter's hand. I need you to tell me everything you remember from that day, Sarah said gently. I know it's hard, sweetheart, but it's important. Can you try? Emma nodded, her small face serious. She clutched the carved bird Jacob had given her in her free hand, using it as an anchor. I wanted to see where Papa worked, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. You were hanging clothes. I was supposed to play in the yard, but I went down the path instead. It's all right, Sarah encouraged. You didn't know what would happen. I followed the trail to the mine, Emma continued. It took a long time. My legs got tired, but I wanted to surprise Papa, see him smile when I came. When I got close, I heard yelling. I got scared. I hid behind the big rocks near the mine entrance. What were they yelling about? Sarah asked, Emma's brow furrowed in concentration. The bad man said Papa was stealing. Papa said no, the land was his, he had papers. The bad man said the papers were lies. He called Papa bad names. Papa told him to leave. The bad man wouldn't leave. Sarah's heart ached, imagining Thomas in those final moments, trying to reason with an unreasonable man, unaware that his young daughter was watching from the rocks. Then what happened? She prompted gently. Emma's hand tightened in hers. They were by the big hole. The one Papa said was dangerous. Papa turned to walk away. The bad man grabbed Papa's shoulder and pushed him hard. Papa went backward, into the hole. I heard him fall. It was loud, then quiet. Tears rolled down Emma's cheeks, but she kept speaking as though now that the words had started, they wouldn't stop. The bad man looked down in the hole for a long time. Then he looked around. I made myself very small behind the rocks. I didn't breathe. I thought maybe he saw me, but he didn't. He walked away fast. After a long time, I stood up. I wanted to help Papa, but I was scared. So I ran home. I ran and ran. When I got here, I didn't tell you. I thought if I told you, the bad man would come. If I told you, it would be real. If I didn't say anything, maybe it didn't happen. And then the men came to tell us Papa was gone, Sarah said softly. Emma nodded. They said accident. But I knew it wasn't accident. It was the bad man. And I thought if I could see things, I might see the bad man again. I might see more bad things happen. So I made myself not see. If I couldn't see, nothing bad could happen. Mama would be safe. I would be safe. Sarah pulled Emma close, her heart breaking for the terrible logic of a traumatized child. Oh, my darling girl, you've been carrying this alone for so long. I'm so sorry you felt you had to. Emma buried her face in Sarah's shoulder. Are you mad at me? Mad? Sarah pulled back to look at her daughter in surprise. Mad at you? Sweetheart, no. I could never be mad at you for this. You were 4 years old, and you saw something no child should ever see. You did what you needed to do to survive. I'm not mad. I'm heartbroken that you suffered so much, but I'm not mad. They sat in silence for a while, holding each other. Outside, Sarah could hear Jacob moving around the cabin, the steady thunk of an axe splitting wood. Normal sounds, reassuring in their ordinariness. Finally, Emma spoke again. Mama? What's going to happen now? It was a good question, and Sarah wished she had a good answer. I don't know exactly, she admitted. But Jacob is going to help us figure it out. We're going to make sure the bad man can't hurt anyone else. And we're going to make sure you're safe. What if the bad man finds out I saw him? Emma's voice was small and frightened. Then Jacob and I will protect you, Sarah said firmly. But Emma, the bad man doesn't know you were there. As far as he knows, no one saw what he did. That's why he's been able to go on as if nothing happened. You're safe because he thinks he got away with it. Emma considered this. But if we tell people what he did, he'll know I saw him. Sarah's stomach clenched. Emma was right, of course. The moment they went to the authorities with Emma's testimony, Marcus Cullen would know there had been a witness. And he would know who that witness was. Jacob came in then, stamping snow from his boots. He'd been outside for hours, and his face was red from cold, but there was satisfaction in his expression. Cabin's as secure as I can make it without proper materials, he said. Anyone trying to get in will make noise doing it, and we'll have warning. He noticed the serious expressions on their faces and paused, reading the situation. What's wrong? Sarah explained Emma's concern. She's right. The moment we accuse Cullen, he'll know she witnessed the murder. We'll be putting a target on her back. Jacob hung his coat on the peg and moved to warm his hands by the fire. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he turned to face them. Then we don't go straight to the authorities, he said. First, we gather evidence. We confirm Cullen's whereabouts, his relationship with Thomas, his claim boundaries. We find out if anyone else had suspicions about Thomas's death. We build a case so strong that when we do come forward, the marshal will have no choice but to arrest Cullen immediately. No time for him to run or to try to eliminate witnesses. How do we do that? Sarah asked. I'll start by riding to the settlement tomorrow, Jacob said. I'll talk to the mine foreman, the claim office, anyone who might have information. I'll be discreet. I won't mention Emma or her testimony. I'll just ask questions about the accident, see what people remember, what they thought at the time. Sarah nodded slowly. It was a sound plan, careful and measured. And while you're gone, you stay inside, Jacob said firmly. Keep the doors barred. Don't answer to anyone but me. I'll be back before dark tomorrow. Can you do that? We can, Sarah said, though the thought of being alone again, even for a day, made her anxious. Emma had been listening quietly, her grey eyes moving between the adults. Now she spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been. I want to help. Both adults looked at her in surprise. Jacob crouched down to her level. You are helping, Emma. By telling us what you saw, you've already helped more than you know. But right now, the best way you can help is by staying safe and letting the grown-ups handle the dangerous parts." Emma's mouth set in a stubborn line, an expression Sarah remembered from before Thomas died, when Emma had been a normal, willful child. "But I'm the only one who saw what happened. I know what the bad man looks like. I remember things about that day." "That's important, isn't it?" Jacob glanced at Sarah, a question in his eyes. Sarah felt torn. Part of her wanted to shield Emma from everything, to wrap her in safety and never let the ugliness of the world touch her again. But another part, the part that had raised a child in the wilderness, that had survived loss and hardship, understood that Emma needed to feel she had some control, some agency in what happened next. "It is important," Sarah said carefully. "What do you remember, Emma? Besides what you've already told us?" Emma thought hard, her face scrunched in concentration. "The bad man had a shiny thing on a chain, in his pocket, but it fell out when he pushed Papa. It was on the ground by the rocks where I was hiding. After he left, I saw it there." Jacob's attention sharpened. "What kind of shiny thing? Can you describe it?" "Round and silver," Emma said, "with a lid that opens. Papa had one too. For telling time." "A pocket watch," Sarah said, her pulse quickening. "Marcus Cullen dropped his pocket watch at the scene?" "I think so," Emma said. "I was going to pick it up, but I got scared and ran instead." Jacob stood abruptly. "That's evidence, physical evidence, that places him at the scene at the time of death. If it's still there, if we can find it, and it has his name or initials—" "It's been 2 years," Sarah said doubtfully. "Surely someone would have found it by now, or weather would have destroyed it." "Maybe," Jacob agreed, "but maybe not. Mine sites are dangerous. People don't go poking around them without reason. And if it fell into a crevice or under rocks, it could still be there." He looked at Emma again. "Can you show me where you were hiding, where you saw the watch fall?" Emma nodded. "I remember." "By the big rocks that look like a bear." "Bear Rock," Sarah said. "I know where that is. It's on the north side of the mine entrance." Jacob began pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "If I ride down tomorrow and the watch is still there, we have physical evidence. Combined with Emma's testimony and whatever else I can dig up about Cullen's relationship with Thomas, we might have enough for the territorial marshal to make an arrest." "But wouldn't Cullen have gone back for the watch?" Sarah asked. "If he realized he'd dropped it?" "Not necessarily," Jacob said. "Think about it. He'd just committed murder. He'd pushed a man to his death. His first thought would be to get away from the scene as quickly as possible. Later, maybe he'd realize he'd lost the watch, but by then there would be people around. The men who found Thomas's body, the mine foreman investigating. He couldn't risk going back without raising suspicion. It made sense." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "So we might actually be able to prove what happened." "We might," Jacob agreed, "but we have to be smart about this. If I find the watch, I can't just take it to the marshal without explaining how I knew where to look. That would lead back to Emma, and we're trying to avoid that until we have Cullen in custody. So, what do we do with it if you find it?" Sarah asked. Jacob thought for a moment. "We keep it safe. We use it to confirm Emma's story for ourselves. Then I do more digging, find out where Cullen is now, whether he's still in the territory, build the rest of the case. When we're ready, when we have everything lined up, then we go to the marshal with all of it at once. Emma's testimony, the watch, whatever else I can find, we give him no choice but to act immediately. It was a good plan, methodical and careful. But it would take time, and Sarah wasn't sure how much time they had. What if Cullen comes here before then? What if he somehow finds out we're asking questions?" "That's why I'm not going to ask questions about him directly," Jacob said. "I'll ask about Thomas, about the mining operation, about that time in general. I'll be a curious stranger, nothing more. And while I'm gone, you two stay locked in tight. I'll be back before dark tomorrow. After that, I won't leave you alone again until this is finished." Emma had been listening intently, her small face serious. Now she slipped down from the bed and crossed to Jacob. She looked up at him with those clear grey eyes and said, "Promise?" "Promise what, little one?" Jacob asked gently. Promise you'll come back. Promise you won't leave us alone." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a flash of pain so deep it made Sarah's chest ache. She remembered what he'd said the night before, that he'd lost a child, that he understood trauma. Looking at him now, seeing the way he looked at Emma, Sarah realized his loss must have been sudden and devastating. Perhaps he'd been away when it happened. Perhaps he'd failed to protect someone he loved, and the guilt of it had driven him into the mountains, into self-imposed isolation. Jacob knelt down and took both of Emma's small hands in his large, weathered ones. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I will come back. And I will do everything in my power to keep you and your mama safe. You have my word, Emma, and I don't give my word lightly." Emma studied his face for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied. She surprised both adults by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around Jacob's neck in a quick hug before darting back to Sarah's side. Jacob stood slowly, clearing his throat. His eyes were suspiciously bright. "Well then," he said gruffly, "I better get some rest if I'm riding out at first light. Long day ahead tomorrow." That evening, as the three of them sat around the table eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Sarah had the strange sense of being part of a family again. Emma actually talked during the meal, asking Jacob about the animals he'd seen in the mountains, telling him about a bird's nest she'd found last summer. Her voice was still soft, still a bit hesitant, but she was speaking, engaging, being a child again. Jacob answered her questions with patience and good humor, treating her as an intelligent person worthy of real conversation rather than talking down to her. He told her about watching a mother bear teach her cubs to fish, about tracking a mountain lion through fresh snow, about the time a fox stole his breakfast right off his plate when he wasn't looking. Emma laughed at that last story. Actually laughed. A bright, clear sound that Sarah hadn't heard in so long. It brought tears to her eyes. She turned away, pretending to check on the coffee so they wouldn't see her cry. After dinner, Emma helped clean up without being asked, carrying plates to the wash basin and putting away the dried beans. Normal, everyday tasks that felt miraculous, because Emma was doing them with her eyes open, engaging with the world around her instead of hiding from it. When it came time for bed, Emma hesitated at the door to her small corner, clutching her teddy bear. "Mama," she said quietly, "can I sleep with you tonight?" Sarah's heart swelled. "Of course, sweetheart. Of course you can." They settled together. In Sarah's narrow bed, Emma curled against her mother's side. Jacob had banked the fire and laid out his bedroll near the hearth. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional pop of cooling wood and the whisper of wind outside. "Mama," Emma whispered in the darkness. "Yes, love? I'm glad the mountain man came." Sarah smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's hair. "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." Across the room, she heard Jacob shift in his blankets. She wondered if he was thinking about his own lost child, about the family he'd once had. She wondered what had brought him out of his self-imposed exile at exactly the right moment to knock on her door during a storm. Luck he'd said he didn't believe in, but Sarah was beginning to think perhaps it was something more. Perhaps it was providence or fate, or simply the universe's way of healing old wounds by allowing broken people to help each other mend. Whatever it was, she was grateful. For the first time in 2 years, lying in the darkness with her daughter breathing softly beside her and a good man keeping watch, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt hope. Jacob left at first light, as promised. Sarah stood at the window with Emma, watching him ride down the mountain trail on his sturdy roan horse until he disappeared into the tree line. The morning was clear and cold, the world blanketed in white from the recent storm. Beautiful and pristine and terribly lonely once Jacob was out of sight. "He'll come back?" Emma said quietly, as much to reassure herself as her mother. "Yes," Sarah agreed, though her stomach was tight with worry. "He promised, and he keeps his promises." They spent the morning staying busy. Sarah taught Emma how. Knead bread dough, something the girl had been too young for before and too withdrawn to attempt during her silence. Emma's small hands worked the dough with serious concentration, flour dusting her nose and cheeks. She looked up at Sarah periodically, seeking approval, and Sarah felt her heart ache with love for this brave child who was finding her way back to herself. While the bread rose, Sarah returned to Thomas's journal. She'd only skimmed it the day before, looking for mentions of Cullen. Now she read more carefully, starting from the beginning. Thomas had begun the journal shortly after they'd moved into the Montana Territory, and his early entries were full of optimism and plans for the future. January 15th, 1883. Staked my claim today. The land office clerk said it's a good location, close to where others have found copper. Sarah thinks I'm crazy for bringing her and Emma out here, away from civilization, but I can see our future in these mountains. A real future, with security and prosperity. I'll prove to her that this was the right choice. Sarah smiled sadly. Thomas had proven it in his way. The mine had been productive, the claim valuable. But what good was security and prosperity if the man who'd worked for them was dead? She flipped forward, scanning entries. Most were technical notes about mining, depth of shafts, quality of ore, equipment needs. But occasionally Thomas would write about Emma, and those entries made Sarah's throat tight. April 3rd, 1884. Emma turns 3 today. Made her a wooden doll from pine. She named it Agnes, after Sarah's mother. Watching her play with it, making up stories and giving the doll a voice, reminds me why I'm doing this, so she can have a good life, a safe life, so she never has to struggle the way Sarah and I did growing up. Sarah had to set the journal down for a moment, overcome. Thomas had been a good father, a loving husband. He'd deserved better than to be murdered over a strip of land and some copper ore. When she could continue, she found the entries from October 1885, the final month of Thomas's life. His writing became more terse, more worried. October 1st, Cullen came by again, 3rd time this month. He's convinced there's been an error in the surveys, that my claim overlaps his. I've shown him my papers until I'm blue in the face. He won't accept them. There's something desperate in him lately. His mine isn't producing much, I've heard. Maybe he thinks if he can get my claim added to his, he'll strike it rich. Not my problem, but he's making it my problem. October 5th. Saw Cullen in town. He was drinking at the saloon, telling anyone who'd listened that I'm a claim jumper. It's not true, and anyone who checks the records will know it's not true. But lies have a way of spreading, and I don't like the looks I'm getting from some of the other miners. Need to go to the land office, get certified copies of my claim documents. Make sure everyone knows this land is legally mine. October 8th. Got the certified copies. Showed them to the mine foreman, to the assayer, to anyone whose opinion matters. They all agree. My claim is legitimate. But Cullen won't let it go. He cornered me outside the general store. Said I'd be sorry. Said a man could have an accident in the mines. Lots of ways for accidents to happen. I told him I wasn't scared of his threats. But I am a little. Not for myself, for Sarah and Emma. What if he comes to the cabin? What if he tries to hurt them to get at me? The entry was dated 3 days before Thomas died. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the page. October 11th. Last night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Cullen's threat. This morning I told Sarah that if anything happens to me, if there's ever an accident at the mine, she should tell the marshal it wasn't an accident. She laughed, said I was being morbid. But I made her promise. I don't trust Cullen. The man has murder in his eyes. That was the final entry. 2 days later, Thomas was dead, pushed into a mine shaft by the very man he'd feared, witnessed by the daughter he'd wanted to protect. Sarah heard a sound and looked, up to see Emma standing beside her, looking at the journal. "That's Papa's book," Emma said. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "He wrote about you sometimes, about how much he loved you." Emma climbed onto Sarah's lap, something she hadn't done in 2 years, and Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter. Together, they looked at Thomas's handwriting, his words. the only pieces of him they had left besides memories. He knew the bad man might hurt him, Emma said softly. He wrote it down. Yes, Sarah said. He was trying to protect us even then. Did you tell the marshal? Emma asked. Like Papa wanted. Sarah felt shame wash over her. No, she admitted. I didn't. Everyone said it was an accident, and I was so lost in grief that I believed them. I should have questioned it. I should have insisted on an investigation. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry I didn't listen to what Papa was trying to tell me. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You didn't know I saw what happened. You thought it really was an accident. It's not your fault, Mama. The simple forgiveness from her 6-year-old daughter made Sarah's tears flow. She held Emma close, grateful beyond words for this child's resilience and capacity for understanding. They sat together like that for a long while, until Emma finally stirred and said, Mama, can we go look at Papa's grave? Sarah hesitated. The small cemetery where Thomas was buried was a 20-minute walk from the cabin. Jacob had told them to stay inside, to stay safe. But Emma was asking to visit her father's grave for the first time since the funeral. How could Sarah deny her that? I don't know if that's a good idea, Sarah said carefully. Jacob said we should stay in the cabin, but the bad man doesn't. No, we know what he did, Emma reasoned with a child's logic. He thinks we think it was an accident, so he won't be looking for us. And it's daytime, and I want to tell Papa I'm sorry. Sorry for what, sweetheart? Sarah asked, puzzled. For not telling, Emma whispered. For hiding and being scared and not telling anyone what happened. Papa wanted you to tell the marshal, but I was too scared to tell you what I saw, so you couldn't tell the marshal. Papa's been in the ground all this time and nobody knows what really happened to him. I want to tell him I'm sorry and that we're going to make it right now. Sarah's heart broke and mended simultaneously. Emma needed this closure, this chance to speak to her father. And truthfully, Sarah needed it too. She needed to stand at Thomas's grave, knowing the truth, ready to fight for justice. All right, she said, making the decision. We'll go, but we have to be quick and we have to be careful. We'll bring your father's rifle just in case. They bundled up in their warmest clothes, and Sarah retrieved the rifle from above the door. It was a good weapon, well maintained, and she knew how to use it. Thomas had taught her shortly after they'd moved to the territory, insisting that a woman alone in the wilderness needed to know how to protect herself. The walk to the cemetery was quiet. They followed the narrow trail that wound through the pines, their boots crunching in the snow. Emma held Sarah's hand tightly, looking around with wide eyes, as though seeing the world anew. Perhaps in some ways she was. This was the first time she'd been outside, while openly admitting she could see. It's so white, Emma said wonderingly. Everything is white and sparkly. That's the sun on the snow, Sarah explained, like diamonds scattered everywhere. They reached the cemetery, a small clearing where a dozen graves lay marked with simple wooden crosses or rough stone markers. Thomas's grave was near the edge, beneath a large pine tree. His marker was stone, his name and dates carved deep by a stonemason in town. Sarah had insisted on that much, at least. A proper marker for a good man. Emma stood before the grave for a long moment, just looking. Then she knelt in the snow, not seeming to notice the cold, and placed her small hand on the stone. "Hi, Papa," she said softly. "It's me, Emma. I can talk again now. Mama says you loved me very much. I love you too. I'm sorry I didn't tell anyone what the bad man did. I was scared, but I'm going to be brave now, like you wanted. We're going to tell the marshal. We're going to make sure everyone knows you didn't fall by accident. The bad man pushed you, and he's going to get in trouble for it." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her own hand joining Emma's on the cold stone. "We'll get justice for you, Thomas," she whispered. "I promise. Emma and I and Jacob, we're going to make this right." They stayed there for several minutes, the winter wind whispering through the pines, until Sarah became aware of how exposed they were. Out in the open, far from the cabin, with the afternoon sun already beginning its descent. They needed to get back. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, helping Emma to her feet. "We should go home now." Emma nodded, but she looked back at the grave one more time. "Bye, Papa," she said. "We'll come back and tell you when it's all fixed." They were halfway back to the cabin when Sarah noticed the boot prints in the snow. Fresh prints, crossing their trail at an angle. Someone had been walking through these woods very recently, and not on the main path. Sarah's blood ran cold. She pulled Emma close and quickened their pace, her eyes scanning the trees. The prints were large, made by a man's boots. They came from the direction of the cabin and headed off toward the east. Someone had been at their cabin. Someone had been there while they were gone. Sarah's heart pounded as they hurried the last 100 yards. When the cabin came into view, everything looked normal. The door was still closed, the shutters latched. No smoke rose from the chimney anymore, but that was to be expected. The fire would have burned down while they were gone. But something felt wrong. Sarah couldn't name it, but every instinct screamed danger. She stopped at the tree line, holding Emma back. "Stay here," she whispered. "Stay hidden behind this tree and don't move until I tell you it's safe." "Mama!" Emma's voice was frightened. "I need to make sure it's safe," Sarah said firmly. "I'll be right back. If anything happens, if you hear anything scary, you run. You run as fast as you can toward town, and you don't stop until you find help. Understand?" Emma nodded, her eyes huge. Sarah gripped the rifle and approached the cabin carefully, watching the windows for any sign of movement. She reached the door and noticed immediately what had set off her instincts. The latch was damaged, the wood around it splintered slightly. Someone had forced the door. She took a deep breath and pushed it open, the rifle raised to her shoulder. The cabin had been searched. Not ransacked, but definitely searched. Drawers stood half open, blankets were disturbed. Her trunk of personal items had been moved. Someone had gone through their belongings looking for something. Looking for what? Evidence that they knew the truth about Thomas? Or perhaps looking for claimed documents, papers that would prove Thomas's ownership of the mine. Sarah moved through the cabin room by room, checking corners, looking for any sign the intruder might still be present. But they were gone, their search complete. On the table, Sarah found something that made her stomach drop. A single pressed wildflower laid carefully on Thomas's journal. Someone wanted them to know they'd been here. Someone wanted them to know they'd seen the journal, read it, understood that Thomas had suspected he might be murdered. And there was only one person who would care about that. Marcus Cullen knew. Somehow he knew they were asking questions, knew they were getting close to the truth. And he'd come here to send a message. "I know where you live. I know about your daughter. I can get to you any time I want." Sarah's hands shook as she backed toward the door. She needed to get Emma and get out of here. They needed to find Jacob, warn him that Cullen was onto them. They needed a sound outside made her freeze, footsteps slow and deliberate. Coming up to the cabin door, Sarah raised the rifle, her finger on the trigger, and waited to see who would appear in the doorway. Jacob appeared in the doorway, and Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. She lowered the rifle with shaking hands as he took in the scene, her pale face, the disturbed cabin, Emma hiding in the trees beyond. "What happened?" he asked sharply, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. "Someone was here," Sarah said, her voice unsteady. "Someone searched the cabin. They left this." She pointed to the wildflower on the journal. Jacob's expression darkened. He moved past her into the cabin, his eyes scanning everything with a professional assessment. "When?" "Within the last hour, I think. We went to Thomas's grave. I know you said to stay inside, but Emma wanted to say goodbye to her father, and I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought we'd be safe. It's daytime, and we didn't think anyone knew." "It's not your fault," Jacob said firmly. He crossed to the window and whistled sharply. Emma emerged from the trees and ran toward the cabin, launching herself at her mother when she reached the door. Sarah held her tight, one hand stroking her daughter's hair. Jacob secured the door and checked each window before turning back to them. "Tell me everything," Sarah explained about the boot prints, the forced latch, the searched cabin. Jacob listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "Did you see anyone?" he asked Emma gently. "When you were waiting in the trees?" Emma shook her head. "Just the footprints. They went away toward the east, toward Cullen's old claim," Jacob said. He moved to the table and picked up the wildflower, examining it. "This is a message." He wants you to know he can get to you. How did he know? Sarah asked. How did he know we were asking questions? I made a mistake, Jacob said, his voice tight with anger. At himself, Sarah realized. At the settlement, I talked to the mine foreman about Thomas's accident. Asked if there'd been any disputes around that time, any tensions between miners. I thought I was being subtle, but the foreman must have mentioned my questions to someone, and word travels fast in small communities. If Cullen's still in the area, he would have heard that someone was poking around, asking about Thomas Mitchell's death. So he came here to see what we know, Sarah said, and to intimidate you, Jacob agreed. To remind you that you're vulnerable, that he can reach you any time. He set down the wildflower and turned to face them fully, but he made a mistake. He gave away that he's worried. An innocent man wouldn't care about someone asking questions about a 2-year-old accident. By coming here, by searching your cabin, he's essentially admitted his guilt, but we have no proof of that, Sarah protested. It's just us saying someone broke in. We didn't see him. No, Jacob agreed. But I found something today. Something that changes everything. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle. He set it on the table and carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside was a silver pocket watch, tarnished and damaged from 2 years of exposure to the elements, but still recognizable. The face was cracked, the hands frozen at 2:47, and on the back, engraved in elaborate script, were the initials MC. Emma gasped. That's it! That's the shiny thing the bad man dropped. Sarah stared at the watch, her heart pounding. You found it. You actually found it. Right where Emma said it would be, Jacob confirmed. Hidden in a crevice near Bear Rock. I almost missed it, had to move several smaller stones to get to it. But it was there, exactly where a pocket watch might fall if it slipped from someone's vest pocket during a struggle. He turned the watch over, showing them the engraving more clearly. MC Marcus Cullen. This, combined with Emma's testimony and Thomas's journal entries, is enough to hang him. Sarah felt a fierce surge of hope, followed immediately by fear. But now he knows we're onto him. He's already been here once. What's to stop him from coming back? Me, Jacob said flatly. I'm not leaving you alone again. And we're not waiting anymore. Tomorrow, at first light, we ride to the Territorial Marshal's office. All 3 of us. We take the watch, the journal, and Emma's testimony. We get Cullen arrested before he can do anything else. The Marshal's office is 2 days' ride, Sarah said. Can we make it safely? We'll have to, Jacob said. Staying here now is more dangerous than traveling. Cullen knows where you are, at least on the trail. We can see anyone coming. And once we reach the Marshal, you'll have official protection, Sarah nodded slowly. It made sense. But the thought of leaving the only home she'd known in the territory, of fleeing in the night like criminals when they'd done nothing wrong, grated against everything in her. This was her cabin, her land, her husband's claim. She'd be damned if she'd let Marcus Cullen drive her out, but she had Emma to think of. Emma's safety came before her pride. All right, she said. We'll leave at first light, but tonight we need to be ready for anything. If Cullen realizes we have the watch, if he decides to come back, then we'll be ready for him, Jacob said. He moved to the window and looked out at the fading daylight. I want us to take watches tonight. 1 person awake at all times. I'll take the first watch, then you, then back to me. We don't let our guard down for a second. That evening, they prepared for the journey. Sarah packed their essential belongings. Clothes, food, ammunition, Thomas's journal, and important papers. Jacob checked their weapons and made sure they had enough supplies for several days on the trail. Emma helped where she could, her small face serious and determined. While they worked, Sarah found herself in her mother's old trunk, looking for warmer clothes for Emma. At the bottom, beneath layers of fabric, her hand touched something hard and rectangular. She pulled it out, a music box she'd forgotten she had. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through the generations, and her mother had given it to Sarah on her wedding day. Sarah wound the key on the bottom and opened the lid. A delicate tinkling melody filled the cabin, a waltz, sweet and nostalgic. Inside the box, a tiny porcelain ballerina spun slowly on her platform. Emma's head jerked up at the sound. She crossed to Sarah, drawn by the music, and stared at the music box with wide eyes. Sarah watched her daughter's face transform, wonder replacing fear, memory replacing trauma. Emma reached out hesitantly and touched the spinning ballerina with one finger, stopping its rotation. "I remember this," Emma whispered. "Grandmama had it. She used to let me wind it up when we visited." "That's right," Sarah said softly. "She wanted you to have it someday. I'd forgotten it was in here." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the tears of grief Sarah had grown accustomed to seeing. These were different, the tears of someone remembering joy after a long period of pain. Emma watched the ballerina spin and suddenly said, "I want to remember things, not just the bad things. I want to remember Papa laughing. I want to remember Grandmama's house. I want to remember being happy." Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Then we'll remember together. Every good memory we have we'll keep safe. The bad things happened, Emma, but they don't erase all the good things that came before." Jacob had stopped his preparations to listen. When Sarah looked up, she saw something raw and painful in his expression, a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. He turned away quickly, but not before Sarah saw the shine of moisture in his eyes. "Jacob," she said gently. He cleared his throat. "I'm going to check the perimeter. Make sure we're secure for the night." He moved toward the door, clearly needing space. "Jacob, wait," Sarah said. She set the music box down and stood. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" He paused with his hand on the door latch, his back to them. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then quietly he said, "I had a son once, Samuel. He'd be about 8 now if he'd lived." Sarah's heart clenched. "What happened?" "There was a fire," Jacob said, his voice rough. 5 years ago. I was away working as a scout for the army. I'd been gone 3 months. My wife and son were living in a small house in a settlement near Fort Benton. A lamp got knocked over in the night, they said. The whole place went up before anyone could help. They were both," his voice broke. "They didn't suffer, they told me. The smoke got them before the flames. As if that was supposed to be a comfort." "Oh, Jacob," Sarah breathed. "I wasn't there," Jacob continued, the words pouring out now as though a dam had broken. "I was off tracking some deserters through the wilderness, doing my job, being the good soldier. And my family burned to death while I was gone. If I'd been there, maybe I could have saved them. Maybe I would have woken up, smelled the smoke, gotten them out in time. But I wasn't there. I chose the army over them. And they died alone and afraid while I was hundreds of miles away." "That's not your fault," Sarah said firmly. Jacob turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes was terrible to see. "Isn't it? I made choices. I put duty before family. I left them alone and vulnerable, and they paid the price for my choices." "No," Sarah said, moving toward him. "A tragic accident paid the price. You didn't cause that fire, Jacob. You didn't knock over that lamp. You were doing honest work to provide for your family. That's not abandonment. That's not negligence. That's just the cruel randomness of life. I've told myself that for 5 years," Jacob said wearily. "Hasn't made it hurt any less. Hasn't brought them back. So I came out here to the mountains where I couldn't hurt anyone else by failing them. Where the only person I'd disappoint if something went wrong was myself." "But you're not alone anymore," Emma said suddenly. Both adults turned to look at her. She stood beside the music box, her small face earnest. "You're with us now. And you're not failing. You're helping us. You've found the shiny thing that proves the bad man hurt Papa. You're keeping us safe. You're being brave." Jacob's expression crumbled. He knelt down, bringing himself to Emma's level, and she walked straight to him and wrapped her arms around his neck. He held her carefully, as though she might break, and Sarah saw his shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I'm so sorry about your little boy," Emma whispered against his shoulder. "I bet he was nice like you." "He was," Jacob managed. "He was the best little boy in the world. Then he'd be proud of you," Emma said with a child's simple certainty. "For helping other people's little kids be safe." Sarah turned away, giving them privacy, and wiped at her own tears. She understood now why Jacob had been so determined to help them, why he'd looked at Emma with such intensity and care. Emma wasn't just a child who needed protecting. She was Jacob's chance at redemption, his opportunity to save someone when he hadn't been able to save his own son. After a few moments, Jacob composed himself and stood. He cleared his throat roughly and said, "Thank you, Emma. That means more than you know." He looked at Sarah. "I'm going to check the perimeter now. I'll be back in a few minutes." He slipped out into the gathering darkness, and Sarah busied herself making a simple dinner. Emma sat at the table, the music box beside her, occasionally winding it up to hear the melody again. Each time the ballerina spun, Emma watched with rapt attention, as though memorizing every detail. "Mama," Emma said after a while, "do you think Papa would be proud of me for being brave now?" Sarah came to the table and cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "Your Papa is proud of you. He's always been proud of you. You survived something terrible, Emma. You found a way to protect yourself when you were too young to know any other way. That took strength. And now you're finding the courage to face it, to tell the truth, to help bring a bad man to justice." "Yes, sweetheart. Papa is very, very proud of you," Emma smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. "I miss him. I miss him too," Sarah said. "Every single day. But we're going to honor his memory by making sure everyone knows what really happened to him. We're going to make sure his death means something." Jacob returned shortly after, reporting that everything was quiet outside. They ate a subdued dinner, tension humming beneath the ordinary actions of passing plates and pouring coffee. Jacob had positioned himself so he could see the door and both windows, his revolver within easy reach on the table. Night fell fully, and they settled into their watch schedule. Jacob took the first shift, sitting near the fire with his rifle across his knees. Sarah lay down with Emma on her bed, both of them fully dressed, in case they needed to move quickly. Emma fell asleep surprisingly fast, exhausted by the emotional day, but Sarah lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind outside. Around midnight, Jacob woke her gently for her watch. She rose carefully, trying not to disturb Emma, and took his place by the fire. Jacob stretched out on his bedroll but didn't undress or remove his boots. He was asleep within minutes, the deep sleep of a soldier who'd learned to rest whenever possible, because you never knew when the next chance would come. Sarah sat in the quiet darkness, the fire burning low, and thought about everything that had happened in the past few days. A stranger had appeared during a storm and changed their lives completely. He'd seen what she'd missed, asked the questions she'd been too grief-stricken to ask, and given them hope for justice. More than that, he'd given Emma permission to emerge from her self-imposed darkness. And he'd shown Sarah that life could still hold unexpected blessings even after devastating loss. She found herself watching Jacob as he slept. This man who carried his own grief like a physical weight. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, his features strong and honest. But it was more than his appearance that drew her. It was his gentleness with Emma, his competence in crisis, his willingness to stand between them and danger without being asked. Thomas had been gone for 2 years. Sarah had mourned him faithfully, worn his ring on a chain around her neck, kept his memory alive in her heart. But she was still living, still here, still young enough to imagine a future. Was it wrong to feel drawn to Jacob? Was it a betrayal of Thomas's memory, to wonder what it might be like to build something new with this man who understood loss as deeply as she did? She didn't know, but she knew that when Jacob had promised to keep them safe, to see this through to the end, she'd believed him completely. And that kind of trust, that bone-deep certainty that someone would stand with you no matter what, was precious and rare. A sound outside made Sarah tense. She reached for the rifle, her heart pounding. The sound came again, a soft scraping like something moving against the cabin wall. Sarah stood slowly, moving to the window. She peered through the gap in the shutters, but saw nothing in the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making visibility almost impossible. Another sound, this time from the other side of the cabin, as though something or someone was circling the building. Sarah moved to Jacob and touched his shoulder. He woke instantly, alert and ready. "What is it?" he whispered. "Something's outside," she breathed, "circling the cabin." Jacob was on his feet in seconds, his revolver drawn. He moved to the window Sarah had been watching and looked out. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, listening. Then he held up a hand, gesturing for silence. The scratching sound came again, louder now, then a thump against the door, as though something had struck it. Emma stirred in her sleep, whimpering. Jacob crossed to the door and stood to one side of it, his gun raised. Sarah positioned herself on the other side, the rifle ready. They waited, barely breathing. The door latch rattled. Someone was testing it, seeing if it would open. Jacob had barred it from the inside, a heavy beam across the brackets, so it wouldn't give easily. But if someone was determined enough, with the right tools, they could break through. Then, cutting through the tension, a voice called out, "Mrs. Mitchell, are you in there? It's Benjamin Carter from the settlement. There's been an accident. We need help." Sarah looked at Jacob, uncertainty in her eyes. Benjamin Carter ran the general store in the settlement. She knew him, had traded with him many times, but at this hour in the middle of the night, asking for help, it could be genuine or it could be a trick. Jacob shook his head firmly, mouthing the word, "No, don't open the door." The voice came again, more urgent. "Please, Mrs. Mitchell, my boy's hurt bad. We need shelter, and your cabin's the closest. Please." Sarah's heart twisted. What if it was real? What if someone genuinely needed help, and she turned them away? But what if it wasn't? What if this was Cullen, either disguising his voice or forcing someone to call out, trying to get them to open the door? How do we know it's really you? Sarah called through the door, not opening it. "Tell me something only Benjamin Carter would know." A pause. Then, "Last time you came to the store, you bought 3 yards of blue calico fabric, said you were making a dress for Emma. You couldn't decide between the blue and the green, so I gave you a good price on the blue to help you make up your mind." Sarah's breath caught. That was true, that had happened. But had Cullen somehow found out? Had he questioned Carter, forced the information from him? Jacob caught her eye and shook his head again, more emphatically. "Don't trust it. Don't open the door." "I'm sorry," Sarah called back. "We can't open the door right now. If your boy is hurt, you should get him to the doctor in town. We can't help you." Silence. Then, in a completely different voice, cold and hard, the man outside said, "I know you're in there, Mrs. Mitchell. I know you have something that belongs to me. And I know your little girl saw something she shouldn't have seen. We need to talk about that." Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was Cullen. It had been him all along. "We have nothing to say." "Oh, to you," Jacob called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "And we're both armed. You try to come through that door, and you'll be a dead man before you take 2 steps inside." A low chuckle. "Is that the mountain man? Jacob Stone? Word around the settlement is you've been asking questions about Thomas Mitchell's accident. Interesting timing, you showing up here. A stranger taking interest in a widow and her blind daughter. Makes a man wonder what you're really after." "I'm after justice," Jacob said flatly. "And you're going to hang for what you did to Thomas Mitchell." Another silence. Then, big words from a man hiding in a cabin. "But I'm a patient man. I can wait. Winter's hard in these mountains. Lots of things can happen. Fires mostly. Cabins burn so easy. All that dry wood. And it's a long way to the nearest help. By the time anyone got here, there'd be nothing left but ashes. If you try to burn us out, you'll have to come close enough to set the fire," Jacob said. "And when you do, I'll put a bullet through you." "Maybe," Cullen agreed. "Or maybe I just wait. You have to come out eventually, have to leave for supplies, have to travel to wherever you're planning to go with your little story. And when you do, I'll be watching. I'll be waiting, and one by one, accidents will happen. The widow might fall on the trail. The mountain man might get caught in an avalanche. And that little girl, well, tragic thing, a blind child wandering off in the wilderness, could get lost, could fall into a ravine, could disappear and never be found." Emma had woken now, sitting up in bed with fear written across her face. Sarah wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but she didn't dare move from her position by the door. "You've already lost," Jacob said. "We have evidence, your pocket watch found at the scene." Thomas's journal documenting your threats. Emma's testimony of what she witnessed. Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you. Testimony from a blind 6-year-old who hasn't spoken in 2 years? Cullen laughed. Who's going to believe that? And a pocket watch. I lost that years ago, could have been anywhere. And Thomas's journal. Just the ramblings of a paranoid man. You have nothing. Nothing that would stand up in any court. We have enough, Jacob said. And by noon tomorrow we'll have the territorial marshal. So you have a choice, Cullen. You can run now, try to get across the border into Canada before they catch you. Or you can try to come through this door and die tonight. Your choice. The silence stretched out, tense and heavy. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat on the rifle, her muscles cramped from holding her position. Emma had climbed out of bed and was pressing herself against the back wall. Her teddy bear clutched to her chest, her eyes wide and terrified. Finally, Cullen's voice came one more time. This isn't over, Mrs. Mitchell. Not by a long shot. You think you're safe, but you're not. You'll never be safe. Not you, not your daughter, not your protector there. I'll see you all dead before I let you destroy me. Footsteps crunched in the snow, moving away from the cabin. They heard the whinny of a horse, then hoofbeats fading into the distance. Jacob waited a full minute before lowering his revolver. He's gone. For now. Sarah finally moved, rushing to Emma and pulling her into her arms. The child was shaking, tears streaming down her face. It's all right, sweetheart, he can't get in. We're safe, we're safe. But even as she said the words, Sarah knew they weren't true, they weren't safe. Not here, not anymore. Marcus Cullen had made his intentions clear. He would kill them all before he let them expose him. Jacob began gathering their things with quick, efficient movements. We're leaving. Now. Tonight. We're not waiting for dawn. But it's dark, Sarah protested. The trail is safer than staying here, Jacob finished. Cullen will be watching the cabin, waiting for us to leave. But he won't expect us to travel at night. We'll have a head start. By the time he realizes we're gone, we'll be miles away. He was right, and Sarah knew it. She helped him pack, moving quickly, taking only what they could carry easily. Food, water, warm clothes, weapons, the music box, Thomas's journal, and Cullen's pocket watch carefully wrapped and stored in Jacob's saddlebag. Within 20 minutes, they were ready. Jacob went out first, checking to make sure Cullen had truly left. He returned and gestured them forward. His tracks head east, back toward his old claim. We're going west, toward the territorial marshal's office. Move quietly, stay close to me. They slipped out into the cold night air, Sarah holding Emma's hand tightly. Jacob led his horse, not mounting yet, wanting to be able to move quickly if needed. They walked in single file along the trail, moving as silently as possible through the snow. Sarah looked back once at the cabin, her home for the past 5 years. The place where she'd lived with Thomas, where Emma had been a happy child, where they'd built their life. She didn't know if she'd ever see it again. Cullen might burn it out of spite, or claim it for himself, or simply let it rot, but she couldn't think about that now. All that mattered was keeping Emma safe and getting justice for Thomas. The night was cold and clear, the moon finally emerging from behind the clouds to light their way. They walked for hours, putting distance between themselves and the cabin, between themselves and Marcus Cullen. Jacob set a steady pace, not too fast for Emma, but not slow enough to leave them vulnerable. As dawn began to break over the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Fear was still there, but it was tempered now by determination. They were fighting back, they were seeking justice, and no matter what happened, they were doing it together. Emma had been silent during the night journey, but now she spoke up. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Jacob walking ahead of them, steady and sure. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "We're going to be all right. Because we're not giving up, and we're not backing down. Your papa deserves justice, and we're going to get it for him. And Jacob won't let the bad man hurt us," Emma added. "No," Sarah agreed, watching the mountain man's broad shoulders, the competent way he navigated the trail. Jacob won't let him hurt us. They walked on as the sun rose higher. Three people bound together by tragedy and determination, heading toward whatever fate awaited them in the territorial marshal's office. They made camp near midday in a sheltered hollow off the main trail. Emma was exhausted from walking through the night, and even Sarah felt the bone-deep weariness of fear and exertion. Jacob built a small fire, carefully positioned so the smoke would dissipate through the trees rather than rising in a visible column. They ate cold biscuits and jerky, washing it down with water from a nearby stream. Emma fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled up in Sarah's lap with her teddy bear. Sarah held her daughter close, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing, grateful beyond words that Emma was safe. Jacob sat across the fire, cleaning his revolver with methodical care. His movements were practiced and efficient, the actions of a man who'd performed this task thousands of times. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah and said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Something I found out yesterday, before I came back to the cabin." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "When I was at the settlement, I didn't just talk to the mine foreman," Jacob said. "I went to the land office as well, checked the claim records. Wanted to verify the dispute between Thomas and Cullen, see if there was any legitimacy to Cullen's accusations." "And?" Sarah prompted. "Thomas's claim was completely legal," Jacob said. "Filed properly, surveyed correctly, no overlap with any existing claims. But that's not the interesting part." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Cullen's claim was filed 6 months after Thomas's, and the boundary Cullen claimed, the one he insisted Thomas was encroaching on, was actually 100 yards away from Thomas's claim. There was no overlap, no dispute. Cullen knew he had no legal standing." Sarah frowned. "Then why did he keep pushing?" "If he knew he couldn't win, because it wasn't really about the boundary," Jacob said. "That's what I realized when I looked at the assay records. Thomas's mine was producing high-quality copper ore, some of the best in the region. Cullen's mine, on the other hand, was barely producing anything. He was broke, drowning in debt, desperate. If he could drive Thomas off his claim or take it from him somehow, he'd have access to that rich vein of ore. So he killed Thomas for money," Sarah said bitterly. "For copper, not just copper," Jacob said. "I found something else in the land office records, something that changes everything." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This is a deed transfer filed 3 weeks after Thomas died. It transfers ownership of Thomas's mining claim from his estate, from you, to Marcus Cullen." Sarah stared at him, not comprehending. "That's impossible. I never sold the claim. I never signed anything. The signature on the deed is yours," Jacob said quietly. "Or at least a very good forgery of your signature. Good enough that the land office clerk accepted it without question." The world seemed to tilt. Sarah felt as though she were falling, even though she sat perfectly still. "He forged my signature? He stole Thomas's claim?" "He did," Jacob confirmed. "And he's been working it for the past 2 years. All the copper ore that mine has produced since Thomas died has gone to Cullen. He's made a fortune off your husband's work." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "That mine belongs to Emma and me. Thomas died for that claim, and Cullen has been profiting from it this whole time." "There's more," Jacob said grimly. "I talked to some of the miners who worked for Cullen. They said he came into money suddenly about 6 months ago, enough to hire a crew, buy new equipment, expand his operation. The timing matches with when the main vein in Thomas's mine really opened up. So not only did he murder my husband and steal our claim, he's become wealthy from it," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. "Which is why he's so desperate to keep you quiet," Jacob said. "It's not just about avoiding a murder charge anymore. If the truth comes out, he loses everything. The claim reverts to you, and he has to give back all the money he's made from it. He'll be bankrupted and hanged. He has everything to lose." Sarah looked down at Emma sleeping in her lap, so small and innocent. "He killed her father and stole her inheritance. And he would have killed her too if she'd revealed what she'd seen." "Yes," Jacob said. "He's a dangerous man with nothing left to lose. Which is why we need to be very careful from here on out." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. Then something occurred to her. Jacob, if the deed transfer was filed 3 weeks after Thomas died, and I never signed it, then Cullen must have forged it right away. Which means he planned it, Jacob finished. Thomas's death wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision during an argument. Cullen premeditated it. He planned to kill Thomas, forge the deed transfer, and take the claim. That makes it first-degree murder. The cold calculation of it chilled Sarah to her bones. This wasn't just a man who'd lost his temper and pushed someone in a fit of rage. This was a man who'd planned a murder, executed it, and then systematically stolen everything the victim had worked for. It was evil in its purest form. We need that deed, Sarah said, for evidence, to prove he forged my signature. I have a copy, Jacob said, patting his coat pocket. The clerk at the land office was happy to provide it for a small fee. We can have a handwriting expert compare it to your actual signature, prove it's a forgery. But even with that, even with the pocket watch and Emma's testimony and Thomas's journal, will it be enough? Sarah asked. Cullen said no one would believe a blind 6-year-old who hasn't spoken in 2 years. Emma isn't blind, and she's speaking now, Jacob pointed out. Any reasonable person who talks to her for 5 minutes will see that she's intelligent and coherent. Her testimony will carry weight, especially when it's backed up by physical evidence. And what about Cullen's threat? Sarah asked. He said he'd come after us, that we'd never be safe. What if he follows us? What if he tries to stop us before we reach the marshal? He might try, Jacob acknowledged, which is why we're not traveling the main trail. I know these mountains. There are old game trails, paths that most people don't know about. We'll take the long way around, avoid the obvious routes. It'll add a day to our journey, but it'll be safer. Sarah nodded, accepting his judgment. She trusted Jacob's experience and his instincts. If he said they needed to take the back trails, then that's what they'd do. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Sarah stroked her hair gently, and the girl settled again. Looking at her daughter's peaceful face, Sarah felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in her. Emma had already suffered so much. She deserved safety, justice, and a chance to be a normal child again. And Sarah would move heaven and earth to give her that, Jacob, she said quietly. Thank you for everything, for seeing what I missed, for helping us, for protecting us. I don't know how we would have survived this without you. Jacob's expression softened. You would have figured it out eventually. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Sarah. You survived 2 years alone in the wilderness, raised a traumatized child with patience and love, kept your claim running. You're one of the strongest women I've ever met. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. I did what I had to do. Any mother would. Not any mother, Jacob said. Most would have given up, moved back east, given into grief. You stayed. You fought. That takes courage. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. Sarah found herself studying Jacob's face. The lines etched by weather and worry, the silver in his hair, the gentle way he looked at Emma. He was a good man, damaged by loss, but not broken by it. He'd found a way to keep going, to keep caring, to keep fighting for what was right. What will you do? Sarah asked suddenly. After this is over? After we testify and Cullen is arrested? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I've spent 5 years running from my pain, hiding in the mountains. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to live again, instead of just surviving. You could stay, Sarah said, the words out before she could stop them. In the territory, I mean. There's work for a man with your skills. And Emma. Emma would miss you if you left. Jacob met her eyes across the fire, and something passed between them. Understanding, possibility. The fragile beginning of something that might grow into more given time and safety. I'd like that, Jacob said softly. I'd like that very much. They were interrupted by the sound of horses on the trail above them. Jacob was on his feet instantly, his hand on his revolver. He gestured for Sarah to stay quiet and moved to where he could see the trail without being seen. 3 riders passed by, heading east. From her position, Sarah couldn't see them clearly, but she saw Jacob's shoulders relax slightly. After they passed, he returned to the fire. "Miners," he said, heading toward the settlement. Nothing to worry about, but the interruption had broken the moment, and the intimate conversation didn't resume. They spent the afternoon resting, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. When the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they broke camp and continued their journey. Jacob led them off the main trail onto a narrow path that wound through dense forest. It was slow going, especially for Emma, who had to navigate roots and rocks in the fading light. But Jacob was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest, sometimes carrying her on his shoulders when the terrain got too difficult. As darkness fell, they made camp again in another sheltered spot. This time, Jacob didn't build a fire, not wanting to risk the light being seen. They ate a cold dinner and huddled together for warmth as the temperature dropped. Emma fell asleep between Sarah and Jacob, her small body radiating trust and security. Sarah marveled at her daughter's resilience. After everything she'd been through, Emma could still sleep peacefully, trusting the adults to keep her safe. "She's remarkable," Jacob whispered, echoing Sarah's thoughts. "She is," Sarah agreed. "I'm so proud of her. She's braver than I ever was at her age." "She gets that from you," Jacob said. "The strength, the courage." "She's your daughter through and through," Sarah smiled in the darkness. "She has some of Thomas in her too. His stubbornness, his sense of justice. He would be so proud of the way she's fighting for him. He'd be proud of you both," Jacob said. "And he'd be grateful that you're not letting his death go unavenged." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere above them. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush. The wind whispered through the pines. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, at odds with the danger they were fleeing. "Jacob," Sarah said after a while, "what if something happens to us? What if Cullen catches up, or something goes wrong before we reach the marshal? Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be able to tell our story." "Nothing's going to happen," Jacob said firmly. "But if it does," Sarah pressed, "promise me you'll get Emma to safety first. Promise me that no matter what, she survives this. She's the witness. She's the one who can bring Cullen to justice." "If it comes down to a choice, it won't," Jacob interrupted. "I won't let it come to that. We're all getting through this, Sarah, all three of us, together." Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that everything would work out. But she'd learned the hard way that life didn't always follow the script you wanted. Sometimes good people died and bad people prospered. Sometimes justice didn't prevail. Sometimes you lost everything despite fighting as hard as you could. But sometimes, she reminded herself, help came when you needed it most. Sometimes strangers became family. Sometimes hope emerged from despair. And sometimes, just sometimes, truth and justice won out over evil. She had to believe that this was one of those times. She had to believe that Emma's courage in coming forward, that Thomas's written warnings, that the physical evidence they'd gathered, all of it would be enough. They would reach the marshal, they would tell their story, and Marcus Cullen would finally face justice for what he'd done. The night deepened around them, cold and clear. Sarah pulled Emma closer, sharing warmth, and felt Jacob's solid presence on Emma's other side. Whatever happened tomorrow or the day after, whatever dangers they faced, they would face them together. And that, Sarah thought, as she finally drifted toward sleep, made all the difference in the world. The second day of travel was harder than the first. The temperature dropped further, and snow began to fall in the late morning. Not a storm, but a steady curtain of white that made visibility difficult and the trail treacherous. Jacob pushed them forward with determination, knowing that every hour brought them closer to safety, but also aware that their tracks in the fresh snow would be easy to follow if Cullen decided to pursue them. Emma was struggling. Her small legs weren't built for this kind of sustained travel, and despite her courage, Sarah could see exhaustion pulling at her daughter's face. Jacob noticed too and finally stopped in the early afternoon. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, helping Emma sit on a fallen log. "Get some food in you, warm up as best we can." Sarah unpacked the remaining food, while Jacob scouted their surroundings. They were in a narrow valley, steep mountains rising on either side, the trail continuing through a gap ahead. It was exposed terrain, nowhere to hide if someone came upon them, and Sarah didn't like it. But Emma needed rest, and pushing her past her endurance would be dangerous. When Jacob returned, his expression was troubled. Sarah saw it immediately and felt her stomach clench with worry. "What is it?" she asked quietly, not wanting to alarm Emma. "Smoke," Jacob said, nodding toward the south. "Behind us, maybe 3 miles back. Someone's made camp, or someone's following our trail." "Cullen?" Sarah breathed. "Can't say for certain," Jacob said, "but I don't believe in coincidences. We need to move faster." "Can Emma manage?" Sarah looked at her daughter, who was nibbling a piece of hard bread with the mechanical movements of someone too tired to really taste what they were eating. "I don't know." "She's exhausted." Jacob knelt in front of Emma and spoke gently. "Emma, I know you're tired. You've been so brave walking all this way, but we need to keep moving. The bad man might be following us, and we need to reach the marshal before he catches up. Can you keep going? Just a few more hours?" Emma's grey eyes were red-rimmed and weary, but she nodded. "I can do it. That's my girl," Jacob said, ruffling her hair. "Tell you what, I'll carry you for a while. You can rest on my shoulders and keep watch for me." "How's that sound?" Emma managed a small smile. "Okay." They packed up quickly and set off again, Jacob carrying Emma piggyback style, while Sarah walked alongside. The pace was faster now, urgency driving them forward. Sarah kept looking back over her shoulder, scanning the trail behind them for any sign of pursuit. The falling snow both helped and hindered them. It obscured their tracks somewhat, but it also reduced visibility, meaning anyone following could get closer before they'd be spotted. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's nerves were stretched taut as wire. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow in the trees looked like a person. The weight of the rifle in her hands was both comforting and terrifying. She might have to use it, might have to shoot another human being to protect her daughter. Could she do it? Would she hesitate at the crucial moment? She thought of Thomas, of how Cullen had pushed him to his death without mercy or remorse. She thought of Emma's 2 years of silence and self-imposed darkness. She thought of the forged deed, the stolen claim, the calculated evil of a man who would murder for money and then sleep soundly on his profits. Yes, she decided. If it came to it, she could pull the trigger. She would pull the trigger. To protect Emma, she would do anything. Jacob seemed to read her thoughts. Without slowing his pace, he said, "If trouble comes, Sarah, I need you to take Emma and run. Don't stop, don't look back. Head for the marshal's office. It's about 8 miles from here, due west. You'll hit the main road in about 3 miles, and from there it's a straight shot to town. I'm not leaving you to face him alone," Sarah protested. "You won't be leaving me," Jacob said firmly. "You'll be completing the mission, getting Emma to safety, making sure her testimony is heard. That's what matters. Not me, not you, not anything except making sure that little girl gets justice for her father. Jacob, promise me, Sarah. Promise me that if it comes to a fight, you'll take Emma and run. Don't think about me. Just run!" Sarah's throat was tight, but she nodded. "I promise." They pressed on through the falling snow. As evening approached, Jacob pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance. "That's Copper Falls," he said. "The settlement where the marshal's office is. We're almost there." Relief flooded through Sarah. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. Another hour, maybe less, and they'd be under official protection. Cullen couldn't touch them once they were with the marshal, but Jacob's expression remained tense. He set Emma down gently and pulled out his revolver, checking the chambers with practiced hands. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "We're almost there."